The notification popped up on my phone at exactly 7:43 a.m. on a Monday morning that would forever divide my life into before and after. Please report to Human Resources immediately upon arrival. Urgent matter requiring discussion. I stared at the message, coffee growing cold in my hand, wondering what could be so pressing that it couldn't wait for normal business hours or at least include some context. 3 days earlier, I had been celebrating at Meridian Financial's annual holiday party, receiving congratulations on landing our biggest client acquisition of the year. Now, apparently, something urgent needed immediate attention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Alexandra Chen, and until that Monday morning, I was the senior account director at Meridian Financial, a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Chicago. At 29, I had worked my way up from an entry-level analyst position, earning respect through late nights, successful client relationships, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. The company felt like my second home, and my colleagues had become my chosen family in a city where I had arrived 6 years earlier with nothing but ambition and a business degree from Northwestern. I had always prided myself on maintaining the highest professional standards. My track record spoke for itself. I had never missed a deadline, never lost a major client, and had consistently exceeded my quarterly targets for 3 consecutive years. More importantly, I had built a reputation as someone who could be trusted completely. My team of 4 junior analysts looked up to me not just for my expertise, but for my integrity and fairness. I mentored them, advocated for their promotions, and created an environment where everyone felt valued and heard. The Meridian Financial building was a sleek 30-story structure on West Madison Street, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun as I approached the entrance. The lobby was already bustling with early arrivals, the familiar sounds of conversations and clicking heels on marble floors providing a soundtrack to what I assumed would be another productive day. I had arrived 30 minutes early, as was my habit, planning to review client portfolios before the markets opened. Instead, I found myself taking the elevator to the 14th floor, where Human Resources occupied a suite of offices that I had visited only twice before, once during my initial hiring process and once for a promotion review. The department was overseen by Margaret Walsh, a woman in her late 50s who had built a reputation for fairness and discretion. She had always seemed approachable during company meetings, though I had limited direct interaction with her. Margaret's assistant, a young man named David, looked visibly uncomfortable when I announced my arrival. He avoided eye contact, mumbling something about Margaret expecting me and gesturing toward her office door. The unease in his demeanor was immediately apparent, and I felt the first flutter of genuine concern in my stomach. This wasn't the atmosphere I associated with routine company business. Margaret's office was larger than I remembered, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the Chicago River. She sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, her usually warm expression replaced by something more guarded and professional. Beside her sat James Brennan, the company's legal counsel, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, whom I recognized but had never spoken to directly. The presence of legal representation immediately elevated my concern to something approaching alarm. "Alexandra, thank you for coming in so promptly," Margaret began, her voice carefully measured. "Please have a seat. We need to discuss a serious matter that has been brought to our attention." She gestured to one of 2 chairs positioned in front of her desk, and I noticed that James had a legal pad in front of him, his pen poised as if ready to take notes. I settled into the chair, maintaining eye contact with Margaret while trying to project confidence despite the growing knot in my stomach. "Of course, what can I help you with?" I kept my voice steady, drawing on years of client presentations and high-pressure negotiations. Margaret exchanged a brief glance at James before continuing. "We've received a formal complaint regarding your conduct at Friday evening's holiday party. The allegation is quite serious, and we're required to conduct a thorough investigation." She paused as if giving me time to process this information. The complaint alleges sexual conduct and harassment. The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't quite process what she had said. Sexual harassment? The Friday party was a celebration of our successful year, a night where I had spent most of my time talking with clients, colleagues, and team members about upcoming projects and industry trends. I had left the party early, around 10:30, because I had planned to review contracts over the weekend. "I'm sorry," I said slowly, "but I think there must be some mistake. I don't understand what you're referring to." My voice sounded distant to my own ears, as if someone else was speaking. "Could you be more specific about exactly what I'm being accused of?" James leaned forward, his expression serious. "The complaint was filed by Vincent Thorpe, and it alleges that you made unwelcome advances towards him during the party, including inappropriate physical contact and verbal suggestions of a sexual nature. Vincent Thorpe was my direct supervisor, the director of client relations, and someone I had worked with closely for the past 2 years. The absurdity of the accusation was so complete that I almost laughed. Vincent and I had a strictly professional relationship that never even approached anything that could be construed as inappropriate. He was married with 2 young children, and our interactions were always focused on work objectives and client strategies. More importantly, I had built a reputation as someone who could be trusted completely. My team of 4 junior analysts looked up to me not just for my expertise, but for my integrity and fairness. I mentored them, advocated for their promotions, and created an environment where everyone felt valued and heard. The Meridian Financial building was a sleek 30-story structure on West Madison Street, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun as I approached the entrance. The lobby was already bustling with early arrivals, the familiar sounds of conversations and clicking heels on marble floors, providing a soundtrack to what I assumed would be another productive day. "Of course," I replied, though inside I was struggling to comprehend how this situation had developed. "I welcome any investigation. I'm confident it will clear up this misunderstanding quickly." I paused, then added, "May I ask about the specifics of what Vincent is claiming happened? I think it would help me understand how we got to this point." James consulted his notes. "The complaint states that during the party, you approached Mr. Thorpe while he was alone near the bar area, made comments about his appearance, and attempted to initiate physical contact despite his apparent discomfort. It further alleges that you suggested meeting privately after the party for what was implied to be non-professional purposes." Each detail he recited felt increasingly surreal. I had indeed spoken with Vincent briefly near the bar, but it was a conversation about the Morrison account timeline that lasted perhaps 3 minutes. I had not made any comments about his appearance beyond a standard "you look nice this evening" greeting that I had offered to probably 20 people that night. The suggestion of a private meeting was completely fabricated. "None of that happened," I said firmly. "I spoke with Vincent for maybe 3 minutes about work. The conversation was entirely professional, and there were other people nearby throughout. Sarah Kim from accounting was standing right next to us for part of it, and Michael Torres from IT joined the conversation briefly." I realized I was providing details quickly, almost defensively, and forced myself to slow down. Margaret continued taking notes. "We'll need to speak with those witnesses as part of our investigation. In the meantime, I'm afraid we need to place you on administrative leave pending the outcome of our inquiry. This is standard procedure and shouldn't be interpreted as an assumption of guilt." Administrative leave. The words echoed in my mind as I tried to process their implications. I would be barred from the office, unable to access my files or communicate with clients while this investigation played out. The Morrison project I had been leading was set to close next week, and the Hartwell expansion required my immediate attention. Beyond the professional implications, I couldn't shake the feeling that my reputation was being damaged simply by the existence of these accusations. "How long do you anticipate this investigation will take?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure while my mind raced through the potential consequences. "Typically, these matters are resolved within 1 to 2 weeks," James responded.
We'll be conducting interviews with relevant parties and reviewing any available evidence. You'll be contacted once we have conclusions to share. I nodded, though inside I felt like I was in free fall. I understand. Will I be able to provide additional information or clarification during the process if needed? Absolutely, Margaret assured me. We want to ensure a fair and thorough investigation. If you think of additional details or witnesses that might be relevant, please don't hesitate to contact us. As I prepared to leave, Margaret's expression softened slightly. Alexandra, I want you to know that this is difficult for all of us. You've been a valued member of our team, and we're committed to handling this matter as fairly and discreetly as possible. I appreciated her attempt at reassurance, but the damage felt irreparable. By the time I reached the elevator, I knew that word of my administrative leave would spread through the office quickly. In a company of fewer than 200 employees, very little remained secret for long. People would draw their own conclusions about why I was suddenly absent, and my carefully built reputation could be destroyed regardless of the investigation's outcome. How long do you anticipate this investigation will take? I asked, trying to maintain my composure while my mind raced through the potential consequences. Typically, these matters are resolved within 1 to 2 weeks, James responded. We'll be conducting interviews with relevant parties and reviewing any available evidence. You'll be contacted once we have conclusions to share. I nodded, though inside I felt like I was in free fall. I understand. Will I be able to provide additional information or clarification during the process if needed? Absolutely, Margaret assured me. We want to ensure a fair and thorough investigation. If you think of additional details or witnesses that might be relevant, please don't hesitate to contact us. As I prepared to leave, Margaret's expression softened slightly. Alexandra, I want you to know that this is difficult for all of us. You've been a valued member of our team, and we're committed to handling this matter as fairly and discreetly as possible. I appreciated her attempt at reassurance, but the damage felt irreparable. By the time I reached the elevator, I knew that word of my administrative leave would spread through the office quickly. In a company of fewer than 200 employees, very little remained secret for long. People would draw their own conclusions about why I was suddenly absent, and my carefully built reputation could be destroyed regardless of the investigation's outcome. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt interminable. I kept replaying Friday night in my mind, searching for any interaction that could have been misinterpreted or misconstrued. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this accusation was not based on any actual misunderstanding, but was instead completely deliberate. Vincent and I had worked together closely on several major accounts, and our professional relationship had always been cordial but not particularly warm. He was known throughout the company as someone who was highly political, carefully cultivating relationships with senior management while maintaining distance from those he perceived as potential threats to his advancement. Recently, there had been discussions about restructuring the client relations department, and I knew that my successful account management record had put me in consideration for a promotion that would make me Vincent's peer rather than his subordinate. Sitting in my car in the parking garage, I pulled out my phone and reviewed my calendar from Friday night. I had arrived at the party at 7 o'clock, spent the first hour networking with clients, had dinner with the Hartwell team, and participated in the award ceremony where my successful acquisition was recognized. My brief conversation with Vincent had occurred around 9:15, and I had clear memories of the people who had been nearby throughout the evening. The party had been held at the Meridian Club, an upscale venue that the company used for major events. The space was well lit and constantly busy, making it an unlikely location for the kind of behavior Vincent was describing. More importantly, I had never given him any indication that I was interested in anything beyond a professional relationship. Our interactions had been consistently focused on work objectives, client strategies, and project timelines. I started my car and drove home to my apartment in Lincoln Park, my mind racing through potential explanations and responses. The more I considered the situation, the more certain I became that this accusation was strategic rather than genuine. Vincent had access to information about my career trajectory and would have known that a harassment allegation could derail my advancement completely. My apartment felt different when I walked in, as if the familiar space had been contaminated by the morning's events. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, trying to organize my thoughts and plan my next steps. The immediate priority was documenting everything I could remember about Friday night, including the specific people who had witnessed my interactions with Vincent. I opened my laptop and began creating a detailed timeline of the evening, noting specific conversations, times, and witnesses. Sarah Kim had definitely been present during most of my conversation with Vincent, and she would be able to confirm that nothing inappropriate had occurred. Michael Torres had joined us briefly to discuss the upcoming IT upgrades that would affect the client database.
Both of them could provide testimony that contradicted Vincent's version of events. The more I documented, the more confident I became that the investigation would exonerate me. The problem was the damage that could occur in the meantime. Administrative leave would prevent me from working on my current projects, potentially disappointing clients and damaging relationships I had spent years building. More seriously, the mere existence of a harassment allegation could follow me throughout my career, regardless of its resolution. I spent the rest of Monday reviewing my professional files and preparing materials that might be relevant to the investigation. I compiled emails from the past 6 months showing my interactions with Vincent, all of which were strictly professional. I gathered client feedback and performance reviews that demonstrated my character and professionalism. Most importantly, I prepared a list of colleagues who could speak to my conduct and integrity. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected phone call from Sarah Kim. "Alex, I heard you're out sick today," she said, though her tone suggested she suspected something more serious. "Is everything okay? The Morrison team was asking about the status meeting." I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I'm dealing with a personal matter that required some time away from the office. Could you let the Morrison team know I'll be back as soon as possible?" It wasn't entirely truthful, but I didn't want to discuss the harassment allegation until the investigation was complete. "Of course," Sarah replied. "Actually, that's interesting timing. Vincent called an emergency meeting yesterday afternoon and said he'd be taking over the Morrison account temporarily. He seemed pretty stressed about something." This information was both troubling and revealing. Vincent's immediate move to claim my projects suggested a level of preparation that supported my theory about the strategic nature of his accusation. He wasn't just trying to remove me from consideration for promotion, he was actively positioning himself to benefit from my absence. Wednesday brought a call from Margaret requesting my presence for a follow-up interview. When I arrived at the HR office, I found the same configuration as Monday: Margaret and James seated at the desk, legal pads at the ready. However, their demeanor seemed slightly different, less formal, and more investigative. "Thank you for coming in, Alexandra," Margaret began. "We've had the opportunity to speak with several witnesses from Friday's party, and we'd like to clarify some details with you." She consulted her notes before continuing. "Can you walk us through your interaction with Vincent Thorpe in detail?" I provided the same account I had given on Monday, emphasizing the professional nature of our conversation and the presence of witnesses. "Sarah Kim was standing directly beside us for most of the conversation," I added. "She can confirm that we discussed the Morrison account timeline and Vincent's concerns about the client's budget restrictions." James made several notes before looking up. "The witnesses we've spoken with have provided accounts that are somewhat different from Mr. Thorpe's initial complaint." He exchanged a glance with Margaret before continuing. "Several people observed your interaction with him, and their descriptions don't align with the allegations that were made." I felt a surge of relief mixed with vindication. I'm not surprised by that. The conversation was brief, professional, and witnessed by multiple people. I'm confident that anyone who was present can confirm that nothing inappropriate occurred. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Actually, Alexandra, during our investigation, we've uncovered some additional information that has raised other concerns." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "It appears that this isn't the first time Mr. Thorpe has made allegations of this nature against a female colleague." This revelation was unexpected and significant. If Vincent had a history of making false harassment claims, it would completely change the context of his accusation against me. It would also suggest a pattern of behavior that the company should have been aware of and addressed previously. "Could you elaborate on that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral despite my growing curiosity. James consulted a different set of notes. "We discovered records of 2 previous complaints filed by Mr. Thorpe against female colleagues, both of whom were in positions similar to yours."
In both cases, the investigations concluded that the allegations were unfounded, but the women involved subsequently left the company. The implications of this information were staggering. Vincent had apparently used false harassment allegations as a weapon against women who might compete with him professionally. The fact that his previous targets had left the company suggested that even when the allegations were disproven, the damage to their reputations and careers had been sufficient to drive them away. What happened to those women? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Margaret's expression was grave. Both requested transfers to other departments initially, but ultimately decided to seek employment elsewhere.
The stress of the investigations and the impact on their professional relationships made their positions untenable, even after they were cleared of wrongdoing. I felt a surge of anger on behalf of those women and for myself. Vincent had essentially found a way to eliminate professional competition by exploiting the company's commitment to taking harassment allegations seriously. He had weaponized the very policies designed to protect employees, turning them into tools for advancing his own career at the expense of qualified women. Why wasn't this pattern recognized earlier? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. If there were two previous false allegations, why was a third one taken at face value? James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The previous complaints were handled by different HR personnel, and the pattern wasn't immediately apparent. Additionally, company policy requires that we investigate all allegations thoroughly, regardless of the complainant's history. While I understood the rationale behind investigating every complaint, the failure to recognize a pattern of false allegations seemed like a serious oversight. Vincent had been allowed to continue using this tactic because no one had connected the dots between his previous complaints and his latest accusation against me. What happens now? I asked. Given this new information and the witness statements that contradict Vincent's claims, I assume the investigation will conclude that his allegations are false. Margaret nodded. Based on our findings, we're prepared to close the investigation and restore you to full employment status immediately. However, we need to discuss how to address Mr. Thorpe's conduct and the broader implications of what we've discovered. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the realization that my ordeal was ending while Vincent would likely face consequences for his false allegations. While I wanted him held accountable, I also recognized that this situation was about to become much more complicated for everyone involved. I appreciate that the investigation has cleared me, I said carefully, but I'm concerned about the women who went through this before me. Is there any way to address the harm that was done to them? Margaret and James exchanged another glance. We're consulting with legal counsel about potential remedies, James replied. The situation is complex, particularly since the previous complainants are no longer with the company. As our meeting concluded, Margaret informed me that I could return to work the following Monday and that my administrative leave would be removed from my personnel file. She also mentioned that Vincent would be placed on administrative leave pending further investigation into his conduct. The roles had reversed completely in the span of less than a week. Walking to my car, I felt a mixture of relief, vindication, and lingering anger. The investigation had cleared me, but the experience had been deeply unsettling. I had been forced to defend myself against completely fabricated allegations, and the stress of the past few days had taken a toll. More troubling was the knowledge that Vincent had successfully used this tactic against other women, destroying careers and driving talented employees away from the company. That evening, I received a call from Sarah Kim. Alex, I don't know what's going on, but Vincent was called into HR today and hasn't been seen since. People are starting to ask questions. Her voice carried a mixture of curiosity and concern. I considered how much to share. I can't discuss details, but I'll be back in the office Monday. Things should become clearer then. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was all I could offer while the situation was still being resolved. I'm glad you're coming back, Sarah said. The Morrison project has been in chaos since you left. Vincent tried to take over, but he doesn't understand the client's requirements the way you do. This information reinforced my belief that Vincent's accusation had been motivated by professional jealousy and ambition rather than any genuine grievance. He had tried to remove me from the equation and claim credit for my work, but his lack of actual knowledge about the projects had quickly become apparent.
Friday afternoon brought a call from Margaret requesting another meeting, this time with senior management present. When I arrived at the conference room, I found Margaret, James, and Robert Harrison, the company's chief executive officer. Robert was a man in his early 60s who had built Meridian Financial from a small firm into a respected regional player. I had limited direct interaction with him, though he had personally congratulated me on several major account acquisitions. Alexandra, thank you for coming in, Robert began, his expression serious but not unfriendly. I wanted to speak with you personally about this situation and discuss how we move forward. He gestured for me to take a seat at the conference table. I appreciate that, I replied, settling into the chair while trying to read the atmosphere in the room. Margaret and James seemed more relaxed than they had during our previous meetings, while Robert appeared to be carefully considering his words. First, I want to apologize on behalf of the company for what you've experienced this week, Robert continued. While we were required to investigate the allegations that were made, the stress and uncertainty you've endured is regrettable, particularly given what we now know about the circumstances. His acknowledgement meant more than I had expected. Too often, companies focused on covering their legal exposure rather than addressing the human impact of false allegations. Robert's willingness to apologize suggested that Meridian was committed to handling the situation appropriately. The investigation has revealed serious concerns about Mr. Thorpe's conduct, not just regarding you, but in relation to previous employees, Robert said. We're taking steps to address these issues comprehensively. James leaned forward. We've decided to terminate Mr. Thorpe's employment immediately.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His pattern of making false allegations constitutes a serious violation of company policy and professional ethics. While I felt vindicated by this decision, I also recognized that Vincent's termination would create its own complications. He had been responsible for several major accounts, and his sudden departure would require significant reorganization within the client relations department. Additionally, Robert continued, we're implementing new procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. This includes better tracking of harassment complaints and additional training for management personnel. These were positive steps, but they didn't address the fundamental problem of how false allegations could be used as weapons against professional competitors. The company's commitment to investigating all complaints was appropriate, but there needed to be better mechanisms for identifying patterns of abuse. I'm glad to hear about these changes, I said, but I'm also concerned about the women who were affected by this pattern previously. Is there any consideration being given to reaching out to them? Margaret nodded. We're in the process of contacting the previous complainants to inform them of what we've discovered. While we can't undo the damage that was done, we want them to know that their experiences contributed to identifying this pattern. Robert cleared his throat. Alexandra, I want to discuss your future with the company. Obviously, this experience has been difficult, and we understand if you have concerns about continuing your employment here. I had been expecting this conversation, and I had given considerable thought to how I wanted to respond. While the investigation had cleared me, the experience had revealed some troubling aspects of the company's culture and procedures. At the same time, I had invested years in building my career at Meridian, and I wasn't ready to let Vincent's actions drive me away. I appreciate your concern, I replied. This has certainly been a challenging week, but I'm committed to my work here and to my team. I think the changes you're implementing will help prevent similar situations, and I'm willing to be part of that process. Robert seemed relieved by my response. We're grateful for that. Actually, with Mr. Thorpe's departure, we need to restructure the client relations department. We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Client Relations, effective immediately. The promotion was everything I had been working toward, but receiving it under these circumstances felt complicated. On one hand, it represented recognition of my abilities and achievements. On the other hand, it was directly connected to Vincent's misconduct and termination. That's a significant opportunity, I said carefully. Could I have some time to consider the offer and discuss the specific responsibilities and expectations? Of course, Robert replied. Take the weekend to think it over. We can discuss details on Monday. As I left the meeting, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. The investigation had not only cleared me, but had led to Vincent's termination and my promotion to the position I had been seeking.
However, the path to this outcome had been traumatic and revealing. I had learned things about the company and about workplace dynamics that would influence how I approached my career going forward. The weekend gave me time to process everything that had happened and to consider my options. The promotion represented a significant advancement in my career, but it also came with the challenge of rebuilding a department that had been damaged by Vincent's conduct. Several major clients would need reassurance about the transition, and the remaining staff would require strong leadership to navigate the changes. More importantly, I realized that my experience could serve a broader purpose. By accepting the promotion and succeeding in the role, I could demonstrate that false allegations would not be allowed to destroy careers. I could also implement changes that would better protect future employees from similar attacks. Monday morning, I returned to Meridian Financial for the first time in over a week. The atmosphere in the office was noticeably different, with colleagues offering supportive glances and quiet words of encouragement. Word of Vincent's termination had apparently spread quickly, though the specific details remained confidential. My first stop was Margaret's office, where I formally accepted the promotion to Director of Client Relations. We discussed the transition timeline, my new responsibilities, and the resources I would need to succeed in the role. She also provided me with access to Vincent's files and client portfolios, which would be essential for maintaining continuity with existing accounts. The Morrison project, which had been in limbo during my absence, required immediate attention. I spent the morning reviewing Vincent's notes and reaching out to the client to schedule a status meeting. Their relief at my return was apparent, and I was able to quickly restore their confidence in our ability to complete the project successfully. By the end of my first day back, I had begun to appreciate the full scope of the opportunity I had been given. The director position would allow me to implement the client-focused approach I had always advocated, and it came with the authority to make meaningful changes to how the department operated. However, the most satisfying aspect of my return was the response from my team and colleagues. The junior analysts I had mentored seemed genuinely relieved to have me back, and several senior colleagues made a point of expressing their support. It was clear that Vincent's accusations had been met with skepticism from people who knew my character and work ethic. That evening, I received a call from one of the women who had previously been targeted by Vincent's false allegations. Margaret had provided her with my contact information, and she wanted to thank me for pursuing the investigation that had finally exposed his pattern of behavior. "I knew I wasn't crazy," she said, her voice emotional. "When Vincent made those accusations against me, I felt like I was losing my mind. Everyone kept telling me that the investigation cleared me, but the damage was already done." Her experience reinforced my conviction that accepting the promotion had been the right decision. By staying with the company and succeeding in Vincent's former role, I was sending a message that false allegations would not be allowed to derail careers or drive away talented employees. The following weeks brought the challenges I had expected as I worked to rebuild relationships with clients and restore confidence in the department.
However, they also brought unexpected rewards. Several clients specifically mentioned their appreciation for my integrity and professionalism, and it became clear that my handling of the false allegations had actually enhanced my reputation rather than damaging it. 3 months later, I was presenting our quarterly results to the executive team, reporting the highest client satisfaction scores in the department's history and the successful completion of several major projects that had been in jeopardy during the transition. The Morrison project had not only been completed on time, but had led to an expanded contract worth significantly more than originally anticipated. Robert congratulated me on the results and mentioned that the board of directors had specifically noted the department's turnaround. "You've not only recovered from a difficult situation," he said, "but you've used it as an opportunity to demonstrate exceptional leadership." Sitting in my new office, which had once been Vincent's, I reflected on how dramatically my circumstances had changed. The false harassment allegation that had been intended to destroy my career had instead led to my advancement and to positive changes throughout the company. More importantly, it had revealed strengths and resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about the importance of documentation, the power of witness testimony, and the need for companies to recognize patterns of misconduct. It had also shown me that integrity and professionalism would ultimately prevail, even in the face of deliberate attempts at sabotage.
As I prepared for another client meeting, I thought about the advice I would give to other women facing similar situations. The most important thing was to remain calm and methodical, documenting everything and relying on the truth to emerge through proper investigation. False allegations were serious weapons, but they were also ultimately fragile when confronted with facts and credible witnesses. The story was far from over, but this first chapter had ended with vindication and advancement rather than the destruction Vincent had intended. Sometimes the worst attacks against us become the foundation for our greatest successes, revealing strengths we didn't know we had and opening doors we hadn't known existed. 6 months into my new role as Director of Client Relations, I received an unexpected email that would reveal just how far-reaching Vincent's misconduct had been. The message came from Rebecca Martinez, an employment attorney representing 3 former Meridian Financial employees. She requested a confidential meeting to discuss potential legal action against the company regarding Vincent's pattern of harassment allegations. I agreed to meet Rebecca at a quiet coffee shop in River North, away from the downtown financial district where I might encounter colleagues. She was a woman in her early 40s with an impressive presence and a reputation for handling high-profile employment cases. When she arrived, she carried a thick folder that suggested extensive documentation. "Miss Chen, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Rebecca began, settling into the corner booth I had selected for privacy. "I represent 3 women who were formerly employed by Meridian Financial, all of whom were targeted by Vincent Thorpe's false harassment allegations." This was the conversation I had been both expecting and dreading. While Vincent's termination had resolved the immediate situation, the broader implications of his conduct were still unfolding. The women he had targeted previously deserved justice, and the company needed to be held accountable for allowing his pattern to continue unchecked. "I'm willing to help in whatever way I can," I replied carefully, though I should mention that I'm still employed by Meridian, so there may be limitations on what I can discuss. Rebecca nodded understandingly. "I appreciate your position. Actually, my clients specifically requested that I speak with you because they believe your experience was the catalyst for finally exposing Vincent's misconduct. They want to thank you for persisting with the investigation." She opened her folder and removed several documents. "What I can tell you is that the pattern was more extensive than even Meridian's investigation revealed. We've identified at least 5 women over a 7-year period who were targeted by Vincent using similar tactics." 5 women. The scope of Vincent's misconduct was staggering. Each false allegation had represented a calculated attack on someone's career, reputation, and livelihood. The fact that he had been allowed to continue this pattern for 7 years suggested systemic failures in how the company handled harassment complaints. "How were you able to identify the additional cases?" I asked, genuinely curious about the investigative process. "Once word spread that Vincent had been terminated for making false allegations, several former employees came forward," Rebecca explained. "Some had never reported his behavior because they didn't think they would be believed. Others had reported it but were told it was a misunderstanding or personality conflict. This information was deeply troubling. It suggested that Vincent's misconduct had been even more pervasive than the formal complaints indicated. Women had been intimidated into silence or had their legitimate concerns dismissed by management who failed to recognize the pattern." "What kind of legal action are your clients considering?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "We're exploring several options, including wrongful termination claims and a potential class action lawsuit for the hostile work environment that Vincent's conduct created," Rebecca replied. The fact that Meridian allowed this pattern to continue for years, despite receiving complaints, suggests negligence in their handling of workplace harassment. I understood the legal reasoning, but I also felt conflicted about potential action against Meridian. The company had ultimately done the right thing by investigating thoroughly and terminating Vincent once his pattern was exposed. However, the years of inaction and the failure to recognize earlier warning signs represented serious failures in leadership and oversight. "I assume you'll need my testimony about what happened to me," I said. "I'm willing to provide that, though I hope we can find a resolution that addresses the harm done without destroying the positive changes that have been implemented." Rebecca smiled slightly. "Actually, that's one of the reasons my clients wanted me to speak with you first. They're not interested in revenge or in damaging Meridian unnecessarily. They want acknowledgement of what happened, appropriate compensation for the harm they suffered, and assurance that other women won't face similar treatment. This approach seemed reasonable and constructive. Rather than seeking maximum damages, the affected women wanted justice and prevention. It was an approach that might allow for a resolution that served everyone's interests while ensuring meaningful change. Our conversation continued for another hour, during which Rebecca outlined the evidence her clients had compiled and the timeline for potential legal action. She also mentioned that several current Meridian employees had expressed interest in supporting the case, though most were concerned about potential retaliation.
As we prepared to leave, Rebecca handed me her business card. Miss Chen, regardless of how this legal matter proceeds, I want you to know that your decision to fight back against Vincent's allegations was incredibly important. You broke a cycle that had been damaging women's careers for years. Walking back to my car, I reflected on the weight of responsibility I felt. My successful defense against Vincent's false allegations had indeed broken his pattern, but it had also revealed the extent of the damage he had inflicted over the years. The knowledge that 5 or more women had suffered because of his calculated misconduct was both motivating and sobering. The following week brought an unexpected development when I received a call from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a workplace psychology consultant who had been hired by Meridian's board of directors to conduct a comprehensive review of company culture and harassment prevention procedures. She requested an interview as part of her assessment. Dr. Walsh's office was located in a professional building near Northwestern University, and her credentials were impressive. She held advanced degrees in organizational psychology and had extensive experience consulting with major corporations on workplace culture issues. Her approach was methodical and thorough, beginning with questions about my overall experience at Meridian before focusing on the harassment allegations. Miss Chen, I'm particularly interested in understanding how Vincent's pattern of false allegations was able to continue for so long without being detected, she said, reviewing notes from our preliminary conversation. Your case was the first time anyone connected the dots between multiple complaints. I considered her question carefully. I think there were several factors involved. The previous complaints were handled by different HR personnel over several years, so the pattern wasn't immediately obvious. Additionally, the women who were targeted often left the company voluntarily after being cleared, which removed them from the environment where they might have shared their experiences. Dr. Walsh made detailed notes as I spoke. That's consistent with what I've heard from other sources. The combination of staff turnover in HR and the departure of complainants created a situation where institutional memory was lost. She leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. There's another factor that concerns me, which is the apparent reluctance of management to question Vincent's credibility despite the repeated allegations. Several former employees have mentioned that he was considered politically savvy and well-connected within the company. This observation highlighted one of the most troubling aspects of the entire situation. Vincent's success in using false allegations as a weapon was enabled partly by his skill at managing relationships with senior leadership. He had cultivated an image of professionalism and competence that made his accusations seem credible, while simultaneously undermining the women he targeted. Vincent was very strategic about how he presented himself, I agreed. He understood office politics and was careful to maintain good relationships with people who could influence his career. That probably made it easier for him to be believed when he made allegations. Dr. Walsh continued her questioning for another hour, exploring topics ranging from company culture to specific procedural failures that had enabled Vincent's misconduct. Her thoroughness was impressive, and I could see why the board had hired her to conduct this review. As our session concluded, she asked a question that caught me off guard. Miss Chen, given everything you've experienced, do you believe Meridian Financial can successfully address these cultural issues, or do you think the problems are too deeply embedded? I paused to consider my response carefully. I think the company has demonstrated a genuine commitment to change since Vincent's pattern was exposed. The leadership has taken responsibility, implemented new procedures, and hired consultants like you to identify additional improvements. Whether those changes will be sufficient depends on how consistently they're applied over time. Dr. Walsh nodded approvingly. That's a very balanced perspective. Change in organizational culture is always challenging, but it's encouraging that you see genuine effort being made. 2 weeks later, Dr. Walsh's preliminary findings were presented to the entire company during a mandatory meeting. Robert Harrison introduced her with comments about the company's commitment to creating a safe and respectful workplace for all employees.
Her presentation was professional but unflinching in its assessment of the failures that had enabled Vincent's misconduct. The investigation has revealed significant gaps in how harassment complaints were tracked and investigated, she reported to the assembled staff. These gaps allowed a pattern of false allegations to continue for several years without being recognized or addressed. She outlined specific recommendations for improvement, including better training for managers, enhanced procedures for investigating complaints, and regular reviews of workplace culture metrics. Most importantly, she recommended the creation of an ombudsman position to provide employees with an alternative channel for reporting concerns. During the question and answer session that followed, several employees asked about accountability for the management failures that had enabled Vincent's pattern. Dr. Walsh's response was diplomatic but clear. The company is taking appropriate steps to address leadership accountability, and additional changes may be announced as the review process continues. After the meeting, I was approached by several colleagues who wanted to express their support and share their own observations about Vincent's behavior. Sarah Kim mentioned that she had always found him creepy, but had never felt comfortable reporting her concerns because she couldn't point to specific misconduct. He had a way of making comments that seemed innocent on the surface, but felt inappropriate, she explained. Like he would compliment women on their appearance in ways that seemed professional but made you uncomfortable. This feedback reinforced my understanding of how skilled manipulators like Vincent operated. They carefully calibrated their behavior to stay just below the threshold of obvious misconduct, while creating an atmosphere of discomfort and intimidation for their targets. Michael Torres from IT shared a different perspective that was equally revealing. Vincent used to ask me about women's computer usage and email patterns, he said quietly.
He claimed it was for workload distribution purposes, but looking back, I think he was gathering information he could use against them. The idea that Vincent had been conducting surveillance on his potential targets was deeply disturbing. It suggested a level of premeditation and calculation that went beyond opportunistic harassment into something approaching stalking behavior. These conversations continued throughout the week as more employees felt comfortable sharing their observations about Vincent's conduct. A picture emerged of someone who had been systematically gathering information, testing boundaries, and targeting women who posed threats to his advancement. The scope and sophistication of his misconduct was far greater than anyone had initially realized. The legal situation with Rebecca Martinez's clients progressed steadily over the following months. Meridian's leadership chose to engage in settlement negotiations rather than fighting the claims in court, recognizing both the strength of the evidence and the company's moral obligation to address the harm that had been done. The settlement terms, while confidential, reportedly included significant financial compensation for the affected women, funding for enhanced harassment prevention programs, and the establishment of a victim assistance fund. More importantly, the agreement included provisions for ongoing monitoring of the company's harassment prevention efforts by an independent third party. As these developments unfolded, I found myself in the unexpected position of being recognized as a leader in workplace harassment prevention. I was invited to speak at industry conferences about my experience, and several professional organizations asked me to participate in panels about creating safer work environments. One particularly meaningful invitation came from the Chicago Women's Business Alliance, which asked me to address their annual conference about overcoming false allegations and workplace retaliation. The audience included hundreds of professional women, many of whom had faced similar challenges in their careers. The most important thing I learned, I told the audience, is that truth and documentation are your best allies when facing false allegations. Keep detailed records of your interactions, identify credible witnesses, and never assume that your reputation alone will protect you from calculated attacks. The response to my presentation was overwhelming. During the networking session that followed, dozens of women approached me to share their own experiences with workplace harassment, false allegations, and professional retaliation. Many had suffered in silence, believing they were isolated incidents rather than part of broader patterns of misconduct. One woman's story particularly resonated with me. She described being targeted by a male colleague who had made false allegations about her competence and professionalism when she was promoted to a position he wanted. While not sexual harassment, the tactics were similar, calculated undermining, designed to damage her reputation and credibility. I felt like I was going crazy, she told me.
He was so skilled at making his criticism seem reasonable and professional, but I knew it was really about gender and jealousy. Your story gives me hope that these patterns can be exposed and stopped. These conversations reinforced my belief that Vincent's misconduct was part of a broader phenomenon affecting women throughout the professional world. False allegations, character assassination, and systematic undermining were tools being used by some men to maintain advantages in competitive workplace environments. As my profile in the harassment community grew, I was approached by researchers studying workplace retaliation and false allegations. Dr. Amanda Foster, a sociology professor at University of Chicago, invited me to participate in a study examining the long-term career impacts of harassment allegations on both accusers and the accused. Your case is particularly interesting, Dr. Foster explained during our initial interview, because it represents a successful defense against false allegations that resulted in positive career outcomes. That's unfortunately quite rare in our data. Her research revealed sobering statistics about the typical outcomes for people facing harassment allegations. Even when investigations concluded that complaints were unfounded, the accused often suffered lasting damage to their reputations and career prospects. The fact that my situation had resulted in promotion and enhanced professional standing was indeed unusual. What factors do you think contributed to your positive outcome? Dr. Foster asked. Most people in similar situations experience ongoing professional difficulties even after being cleared. I considered her question carefully. I think several things worked in my favor. The false allegations were so obviously fabricated that witnesses could easily refute them. The investigation revealed a clear pattern of misconduct by the accuser. And most importantly, I had built strong relationships with colleagues who knew my character and were willing to support me. Dr. Foster nodded, making notes. The social capital factor is crucial. People who have invested in building genuine professional relationships tend to weather these attacks more successfully than those who are more isolated. Her observation highlighted an important lesson for anyone facing similar challenges. Professional relationships based on trust and mutual respect provide protection against false allegations and character attacks. Vincent's accusations against me failed partly because so many colleagues knew they were inconsistent with my established pattern of behavior. The research interview process also provided me with valuable perspective on my own experience. Dr. Foster's questions helped me understand how various factors had contributed to my successful defense and ultimate vindication. More importantly, they helped me recognize lessons that could benefit other women facing similar attacks. As the one-year anniversary of Vincent's false allegations approached, I reflected on how dramatically my life and career had changed. The position I now held was significantly more challenging and rewarding than my previous role, and I had gained recognition as a leader in both client relations and workplace equity. The department I now managed had become a model for other divisions within Meridian Financial. Our client satisfaction scores remained at record highs, our employee retention was excellent, and we had successfully recruited several talented professionals who had been attracted by our reputation for fairness and professional development. Most importantly, the changes implemented throughout the company had created a genuinely safer and more supportive environment for all employees. The new ombudsman position had already handled several complaints effectively, and the enhanced training programs had raised awareness about harassment and retaliation issues. However, the experience had also taught me that progress in addressing workplace misconduct is often fragile and requires constant vigilance. The systems and procedures that protect employees are only as strong as the commitment of leadership to enforce them consistently and fairly. During a conversation with Robert Harrison about the company's progress, he made an observation that stayed with me. Alexandra, what you went through was terrible, but your response to it has made this a better company for everyone. You could have left and pursued legal action, but instead, you chose to stay and help us address the underlying problems.
While I appreciated his recognition, I also wanted him to understand that my choice to stay had been as much about principle as pragmatism. Robert, I stayed because I believe that running away from problems doesn't solve them. If every woman who faces false allegations leaves her job, then the people making those allegations win by default. This conversation crystallized my understanding of why my experience had been so important. By successfully defending against Vincent's false allegations and then thriving in my career afterward,
I had demonstrated that these attacks could be overcome. More importantly, I had helped establish precedents and procedures that would protect other women in the future. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning that would mark another turning point in my career trajectory. Robert called me into his office with news that the board of directors had voted unanimously to promote me to Vice President of Business Development, making me the youngest person and the first woman to hold that position in the company's history. This promotion is based entirely on your exceptional performance over the past year, Robert emphasized. The board recognizes your leadership in transforming the client relations department and your contributions to improving our workplace culture. The promotion represented validation on multiple levels. Professionally, it acknowledged my skills and achievements in building client relationships and managing complex business challenges. Personally, it demonstrated that surviving false allegations and advocating for workplace improvements had enhanced rather than damaged my career prospects. The announcement of my promotion generated significant attention both within the company and in the broader Chicago business community. Several trade publications wrote articles about my advancement, and I was invited to participate in additional speaking engagements about leadership and workplace equity. One particularly meaningful recognition came from the Chicago Business Journal, which named me to their 40 Under 40 list of emerging business leaders. The article highlighted both my professional achievements and my advocacy work in harassment prevention, describing me as a leader who has transformed personal adversity into organizational change. As I prepared for the increased responsibilities of my new role, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. Vincent's false allegations, which had been intended to destroy my career, had instead catalyzed a series of changes that had advanced my professional standing while improving conditions for countless other employees. The experience had taught me that sometimes our greatest challenges become the foundation for our most significant achievements. By choosing to fight back against false accusations rather than accepting defeat, I had not only vindicated myself, but had helped create a safer and more equitable workplace for everyone. Looking toward the future, I was excited about the opportunities my new position would provide to influence company policy and culture on an even broader scale. The lessons I had learned about leadership, integrity, and resilience would continue to guide my approach to both professional challenges and personal growth. The story that had begun with a devastating false accusation had evolved into a narrative of empowerment, justice, and positive change. While I would never minimize the trauma and stress of facing false allegations, I had discovered that these experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and motivation for creating better systems and outcomes for others. As I settled into my new office, I placed on my desk a small framed quote that had sustained me through the darkest moments of the harassment investigation. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Vincent's false allegations had represented an attempt to pervert justice for personal gain, but the ultimate outcome had vindicated both truth and fairness. The work ahead would continue to present challenges, but I faced them with confidence gained through adversity and with the knowledge that standing up for principles, even when the personal cost is high, ultimately leads to outcomes that benefit everyone involved. My new role as Vice President of Business Development came with responsibilities that extended far beyond what I had managed as Director of Client Relations. I now oversaw strategic partnerships, market expansion initiatives, and business development across multiple sectors. The promotion also placed me on the executive leadership team, giving me direct influence over company-wide policies and strategic direction. One of my first initiatives in the new position was to establish a comprehensive mentorship program focused on supporting women and underrepresented groups within the financial services industry. The program paired junior employees with senior leaders, providing structured career development opportunities and creating networks of support that could help prevent isolation and vulnerability. The mentorship program launch attracted attention from other companies in the Chicago financial district, and I found myself fielding calls from executives interested in implementing similar initiatives. This external validation was gratifying, but more importantly, it demonstrated that positive changes at Meridian were having ripple effects throughout the industry. During the program's inaugural event, I had the opportunity to meet Maria Rodriguez, a junior analyst who had joined the company 6 months earlier. She approached me during the networking reception with a combination of nervousness and determination that reminded me of my own early career experiences. Miss Chen, I wanted to thank you personally for creating this program, Maria said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. I've heard about what you went through last year, and knowing that you turned that experience into something positive for all of us means everything. Her words reinforced my conviction that the challenges I had faced were worthwhile if they could help create better opportunities for the next generation of women in finance. Maria's gratitude also reminded me of the responsibility that came with my platform and visibility within the industry. The conversation with Maria led to my decision to establish a quarterly speaking series at Meridian, inviting external experts to address topics related to professional development, workplace equity, and leadership excellence. The series became popular with employees across all levels and departments, creating opportunities for learning and discussion that hadn't existed before. Our first external speaker was Dr. Patricia Williams, a renowned expert on organizational psychology and workplace dynamics. Her presentation about recognizing and addressing unconscious bias was both educational and eye-opening for many attendees. During the question and answer session, several employees shared personal experiences that demonstrated how prevalent these issues were across the organization. Following Dr. Williams' presentation, I was approached by David Chen, a financial analyst who had been with the company for 3 years. Despite sharing a surname, we were not related, though he mentioned that he had followed my career trajectory with interest as another Asian American professional in the industry. Your experience has changed how I think about workplace advocacy, David told me during the reception following the presentation. I used to believe that keeping your head down and focusing on work was the best approach, but seeing how you handled the false allegations has made me realize that sometimes you have to stand up and fight. His perspective highlighted an important aspect of the cultural change that was occurring at Meridian. Employees who had previously avoided involvement in workplace equity issues were beginning to recognize their role in creating and maintaining positive change. The ripple effects of my experience were encouraging others to become advocates and allies. As my first year as vice president progressed, I was asked to lead a major initiative to expand Meridian's presence in the West Coast markets. This project required extensive travel, relationship building, and strategic planning that tested all of my professional skills while providing opportunities for significant business growth. The West Coast expansion project brought me into contact with Linda Morrison, the CEO of Pacific Investment Partners, one of the largest financial services firms in California. Linda had built her company from a small boutique operation into a major regional player, and her reputation for ethical leadership and innovative business practices was well established throughout the industry. During our first meeting in her San Francisco office, Linda mentioned that she had followed news coverage of my experience with Vincent's false allegations. The way you handled that situation impressed a lot of people in our industry, she said. False accusations are a weapon that some people use against successful women, and your response showed others how to fight back effectively. Linda's acknowledgement meant more to me than many of the formal recognitions I had received. As a successful female CEO who had undoubtedly faced her own challenges in a male-dominated industry, her perspective carried particular weight and credibility. Our business discussions revealed opportunities for a strategic partnership that could benefit both companies significantly. Pacific Investment Partners had established relationships with technology companies and startup ventures that aligned perfectly with Meridian's expansion goals, while our Midwest connections and traditional financial services expertise could help them diversify their client base.
The partnership negotiations required several months of careful planning and due diligence, but they also provided me with invaluable experience in high-level business development and strategic alliance creation. The skills I developed during this process would prove essential as my career continued to evolve. While the professional aspects of the partnership were important, the relationship I developed with Linda Morrison became equally valuable. She became an informal mentor, sharing insights about leadership challenges and strategies for navigating complex business environments as a woman in a senior executive role. One thing I've learned, Linda told me during one of our planning sessions, is that women in leadership positions have to be twice as good as their male counterparts, but we also have to be careful not to internalize that pressure in ways that make us overly cautious or risk-averse. Her observation resonated with my own experiences and helped me understand some of the dynamics I had encountered throughout my career.
The need to constantly prove competence and credibility could indeed lead to conservative decision-making that limited growth and advancement opportunities. The Pacific Investment Partners Alliance was formally announced 6 months after our initial meeting, generating significant positive attention for both companies. The partnership was featured in several industry publications, and I was invited to discuss the strategic rationale and expected benefits during a panel discussion at the National Financial Services Conference. The conference panel provided another platform for discussing workplace equity issues alongside business strategy topics. During the audience question period, a young woman asked about balancing advocacy work with career advancement, noting that some senior executives seem to view equity initiatives as distractions from core business objectives. "I think that's a false choice," I responded. "Creating inclusive, equitable workplaces isn't separate from business success, it's essential to it. Companies that fail to address harassment, bias, and discrimination lose talent, damage their reputations, and miss opportunities for innovation and growth." My response generated enthusiastic applause from the audience, and several attendees approached me afterward to continue the conversation. These interactions reinforced my growing reputation as a business leader who could effectively integrate equity advocacy with strategic business development. The success of the Pacific Investment Partners Alliance led to additional opportunities for expanding Meridian's business development efforts. Robert Harrison asked me to explore potential partnerships in the European markets, particularly focusing on sustainable investing and environmental, social, and governance factors that were becoming increasingly important to institutional investors. The European expansion project required extensive research and relationship building across multiple countries and regulatory environments. I assembled a cross-functional team that included legal experts, regulatory specialists, and financial analysts to support the complex process of establishing international business relationships. During a planning meeting for the European expansion, I was approached by James Wright, one of the legal specialists on the project team. James had joined Meridian shortly after Vincent's termination, and he mentioned that my reputation for ethical leadership had been a factor in his decision to accept the position. When I was considering this job, I researched the company's recent history and learned about the harassment situation and how it was handled, James explained. "The fact that leadership took appropriate action and that you were able to advance your career afterward showed me that this was a company that lived up to its values." James's perspective demonstrated how the handling of Vincent's misconduct had become part of Meridian's reputation in the professional community. Qualified candidates were using our response to harassment allegations as a factor in their employment decisions, creating positive recruitment advantages for the company. The European expansion project consumed much of my time over the following months, requiring multiple trips overseas and countless hours of preparation and negotiation. However, the experience provided invaluable exposure to international business practices and regulatory frameworks that would serve me well in future leadership roles. One particularly significant development occurred during a meeting with representatives from Amsterdam-based Sustainable Capital Management, a firm specializing in environmental and social impact investing. Their CEO, Dr. Elizabeth van der Berg, had built the company into one of Europe's leading sustainable investment platforms. "Ms. Chen, we've been following your work in workplace equity alongside your business development achievements," Dr. van der Berg said during our initial meeting. "The combination of strong business results and commitment to social responsibility aligns perfectly with our values and investment philosophy." The conversation with Dr. van der Berg led to discussions about a broader strategic alliance that would go beyond traditional financial services to include collaborative initiatives around workplace equity and sustainable business practices. This partnership concept represented an evolution in how business relationships could address both profit objectives and social impact goals. The negotiations with Sustainable Capital Management were complex, involving regulatory approvals in multiple jurisdictions and careful coordination between teams on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the potential benefits were significant, both financially and in terms of positioning Meridian as a leader in socially responsible business practices. As these international business development efforts progressed, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. The invitation came from the forum's Gender Equality Initiative, which had identified my story as an example of how individual advocacy could drive broader organizational and industry change. The World Economic Forum presentation represented the highest profile speaking opportunity I had received, with an audience that included CEOs, government leaders, and international development experts. The responsibility of representing my company and the broader movement for workplace equity on such a prestigious platform was both exciting and intimidating. My presentation focused on the business case for addressing workplace harassment and the strategies that organizations could implement to create safer, more inclusive environments. I emphasized that equity initiatives weren't just moral imperatives, but also essential components of successful business strategy in competitive global markets. When companies allow harassment and discrimination to flourish, they're not just harming individual employees, I told the Davos audience. They're damaging their own capacity for innovation, growth, and sustainable success. The businesses that will thrive in the future are those that harness the full potential of all their employees. The response to my presentation was overwhelmingly positive, and I was approached by numerous attendees interested in learning more about Meridian's approach to workplace equity and business development. Several international executives expressed interest in potential partnerships or consulting arrangements that could help them implement similar initiatives. One conversation that particularly impressed me was with Dr. Chen Wei, the CEO of a major Chinese investment firm who was exploring expansion into North American markets. Despite sharing a surname and cultural background, Dr. Chen's path to executive leadership had been quite different from mine, but he recognized similar challenges in creating inclusive workplace cultures. The problems you've addressed are universal, Dr. Chen told me during our reception following my presentation. Every country and culture has versions of these dynamics, and the solutions you've developed could be adapted for different contexts. His perspective reinforced my growing understanding that workplace equity issues transcended geographic and cultural boundaries. The principles and practices that had emerged from my experience at Meridian could indeed have broader applications in addressing similar challenges worldwide. The Davos experience also led to an invitation to join the advisory board of the Global Leadership Institute, an organization focused on developing ethical business leadership practices. The board position would provide ongoing opportunities to influence best practices and policy recommendations that could impact businesses throughout the international community. Returning from Switzerland, I found that the international attention generated by my World Economic Forum presentation had created new opportunities for both personal recognition and business development. Several major publications requested interviews about my approach to combining advocacy work with executive leadership responsibilities. The interview with Harvard Business Review was particularly significant, as it provided a platform for discussing the strategic implications of workplace equity initiatives. The article, titled From False Accusations to Global Leadership: How One Executive Transformed Crisis into Competitive Advantage, became one of the publication's most read pieces that year. The key insight, I explained to the HR interviewer, is that responding to workplace challenges with integrity and strategic thinking can create opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise.
The crisis forced us to examine our systems and culture more deeply than we might have done proactively. The Harvard Business Review article generated additional speaking requests and consulting opportunities, but more importantly, it reinforced my reputation as a thought leader who could effectively address complex organizational challenges. The combination of practical experience and strategic perspective was apparently rare enough to attract significant attention. As my second year as vice president progressed, the business results from our various expansion and partnership initiatives began to demonstrate their value. The Pacific Investment Partners Alliance had generated over $30 million in new business, while the European partnerships were showing early signs of similar success. The quantifiable business impact provided important validation for my approach to combining equity advocacy with strategic business development. Critics who had initially viewed workplace culture initiatives as distractions from core business objectives were finding it difficult to argue with the measurable results we were achieving. During Meridian's annual board meeting, I was asked to present a comprehensive review of our business development initiatives and their relationship to our workplace culture improvements. The presentation represented an opportunity to demonstrate how integrated approaches to business strategy and organizational development could create competitive advantages. The businesses that will succeed in the future, I told the board members, are those that recognize talent development, cultural excellence, and strategic growth as interconnected rather than competing priorities. Our results over the past 2 years demonstrate that this integration creates value that neither approach could achieve independently.
Board member Patricia Stevens, the former CEO of a major consulting firm, raised a question that addressed concerns I knew some executives still harbored. Alexandra, how do you balance the time and resources required for equity initiatives with the demands of aggressive business development goals? The question assumes that these are separate activities requiring different resources, I responded, but in practice, the skills and relationships that support inclusive leadership also drive business development success. The same strategic thinking, relationship building, and stakeholder management capabilities serve both objectives. My response seemed to resonate with the board members, several of whom nodded approvingly. The ability to articulate how equity work enhanced rather than competed with business objectives was clearly important for maintaining organizational support and resources. The board meeting concluded with unanimous approval for expanding our international business development efforts and increasing funding for workplace equity initiatives. More significantly, the board voted to create a new executive position, Senior Vice President of Global Strategy and Organizational Excellence, specifically designed to combine these functions. Robert Harrison approached me after the board meeting to discuss the new position. Alexandra, this role was created with you in mind, he said. Your success in demonstrating how workplace equity and business development can be integrated has convinced the board that this approach should be expanded throughout the organization. The promotion to Senior Vice President represented another significant advancement in my career, but more importantly, it provided the platform and resources to implement the integrated approach to business strategy and organizational development on a much larger scale. The position would also place me in the line of succession for the Chief Executive Officer role, should that opportunity arise in the future. As I prepared to transition into the new role, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this point. The false harassment allegations that Vincent had intended to destroy my career had instead catalyzed a series of changes and opportunities that had advanced my professional standing while creating positive impacts for countless other employees and organizations. The experience had taught me that adversity, when met with integrity and strategic thinking, could become the foundation for achievements that would never have been possible otherwise. The skills I had developed in defending against false accusations, building supportive coalitions, and creating systemic change had proven valuable in every subsequent challenge and opportunity. Looking toward the future, I was excited about the possibilities that my new position would provide for expanding these approaches to other organizations and markets. The combination of business development expertise and equity advocacy had created a unique platform for influencing positive change on an international scale. The story that had begun with a devastating false accusation at a company party had evolved into a narrative of empowerment, leadership, and global impact. While I would never minimize the trauma and stress of that initial experience, I had discovered that even the most challenging situations could be transformed into sources of strength and motivation for creating better outcomes for everyone involved. 3 years had passed since Vincent's false allegations first threatened to derail my career, and I found myself preparing for what would become the most significant presentation of my professional life. The boardroom at Meridian Financial was filled with not only our directors, but also representatives from our international partners, regulatory officials, and industry analysts who had come to witness the announcement of our company's largest acquisition in its 40-year history. The acquisition of Nordic Investment Holdings, a Stockholm-based firm specializing in sustainable investment strategies, represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward in my role as Senior Vice President of Global Strategy and Organizational Excellence. The deal would position Meridian as one of the leading sustainable investment platforms in North America, while establishing our first permanent European presence. Standing at the head of the conference table, I looked out at faces that represented billions of dollars in investment capital and decades of combined industry experience. Among them was Dr. Elizabeth Vonderberg, whose partnership with Sustainable Capital Management had provided the foundation for this transformative acquisition. The journey from defending against harassment allegations to leading international business strategy felt surreal, yet every challenge along the way had prepared me for this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice carrying the confidence earned through years of overcoming adversity, today marks not just the largest acquisition in Meridian's history, but the beginning of a new era in how financial services companies can create value for clients while advancing social and environmental objectives. The presentation outlined the strategic rationale for the acquisition, the financial projections, and the integration timeline that would bring Nordic's expertise in sustainable investing to our North American client base. However, the most significant aspect of the announcement was the leadership structure we had negotiated for the combined organization. Robert Harrison would remain as Chief Executive Officer for 2 more years before transitioning to Chairman of the Board, at which point I would assume the CEO role and become responsible for leading the integrated company's operations across 3 continents. The announcement represented not only personal vindication, but also validation of the approach that had emerged from my experience with Vincent's false allegations. Dr. Astrid Larsen, the founder and CEO of Nordic Investment Holdings, had specifically requested that I lead the integration process and eventual succession to the chief executive role. During our negotiations, she had mentioned that my reputation for combining business acumen with ethical leadership had been crucial in her decision to pursue the acquisition rather than other potential partnerships. Ms. Chen, your experience in transforming workplace challenges into competitive advantages aligns perfectly with our philosophy about sustainable business practices, Dr. Larsen had explained during one of our planning sessions in Stockholm. We believe that companies led by people who understand both business strategy and social responsibility will define the future of our industry. The acquisition process had required 18 months of intensive due diligence, regulatory approvals, and stakeholder negotiations across multiple jurisdictions. The complexity of international mergers in the financial services sector demanded expertise in areas ranging from cross-border taxation to cultural integration strategies. One of the most challenging aspects of the integration had been ensuring that Nordic's progressive workplace culture could be preserved while benefiting from Meridian's systematic approach to equity and inclusion. Both companies had reputations for treating employees fairly, but their methods and cultural expressions were quite different. Nordic's approach emphasized work-life balance, collaborative decision-making, and environmental sustainability as core organizational values. Their Stockholm offices featured innovative design elements like rooftop gardens, meditation spaces, and flexible working arrangements that reflect Scandinavian approaches to employee well-being. Meridian's culture, while equally committed to equity and inclusion, had developed within the more traditional framework of American corporate finance. Our initiatives focused on structured mentorship programs, formal diversity metrics, and systematic policy changes that could be measured and replicated across different business units. The integration process required creating hybrid approaches that captured the best elements of both organizational cultures while establishing consistent standards for the combined company. I assembled teams of employees from both organizations to develop new policies and procedures that would govern everything from performance evaluation to professional development opportunities. Maria Rodriguez, who had been among the first participants in Meridian's mentorship program, had evolved into one of my most trusted analysts and was selected to lead the cultural integration team. Her growth from nervous junior employee to confident project leader exemplified the kind of talent development that both companies wanted to preserve and expand. Alexandra, working on this integration has shown me how different organizations can achieve similar goals through completely different methods, Maria observed during one of our planning meetings. The challenge is creating something new that's better than either approach alone.
Her insight captured the fundamental opportunity and challenge of the acquisition. Success would require more than simply combining 2 existing organizations. It would demand creating something innovative that leveraged the strengths of both while addressing the limitations that each had experienced independently. The regulatory approval process for the acquisition had provided additional opportunities to demonstrate how equity and inclusion initiatives could serve business objectives. Financial regulators in both the United States and European Union had become increasingly focused on environmental, social, and governance factors as measures of institutional risk and stability. Our comprehensive approach to workplace equity, combined with Nordic's environmental sustainability expertise, positioned the combined organization favorably with regulators who were evaluating the acquisition's potential impact on market stability and consumer protection. The integration of social responsibility with business strategy was no longer viewed as optional, but as essential for regulatory compliance and competitive success. During the final regulatory hearing in Brussels, I was asked to address concerns about whether American corporate culture could successfully integrate with Nordic's social democratic values. The question reflected broader anxieties about globalization and cultural preservation that were influencing business decisions throughout the international community.
The strength of this acquisition lies precisely in the differences between our organizational cultures, I responded to the regulatory panel. Nordic Investment Holdings brings perspectives on sustainability and work-life balance that will enhance our service offerings, while Meridian contributes systematic approaches to equity and inclusion that can be scaled internationally. The regulatory approval was granted unanimously, with several panel members specifically noting that the cultural integration plan demonstrated how international business expansion could occur without sacrificing local values or employee protections. The decision represented validation of our approach and cleared the final obstacle to completing the acquisition. The announcement of my upcoming promotion to Chief Executive Officer generated significant attention throughout the financial services industry and beyond. Several business publications featured articles about my journey from harassment target to international business leader, while professional organizations requested presentations about the strategies and principles that had guided my career development. The attention was gratifying, but it also carried responsibility to use the platform effectively for advancing opportunities for other women and underrepresented groups in finance. I accepted speaking engagements selectively, focusing on venues where I could reach decision-makers who had the authority to implement meaningful changes in their own organizations. One particularly impactful opportunity came from the International Women's Leadership Summit in Geneva, where I was invited to deliver the keynote address to an audience of over 2,000 women executives from companies around the world. The theme of the conference was Transforming Adversity into Advantage, which aligned perfectly with my own experiences and perspectives. The greatest tragedy of workplace harassment and discrimination, I told the Geneva audience, is not just the immediate harm it causes to individual victims, but the lost potential for innovation and growth that occurs when talented people are driven away or silenced. The presentation explored how my experience with false allegations had ultimately led to systemic changes that benefited entire organizations, creating competitive advantages that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The key insight was that responding to challenges with strategic thinking and collaborative approaches could generate outcomes superior to what any individual could achieve alone. The audience response was enthusiastic, and I was approached afterward by dozens of executives interested in implementing similar integration strategies in their own companies. Several women shared their own experiences with workplace harassment and discrimination, expressing gratitude for seeing an example of how these challenges could be overcome and transformed into sources of strength. Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid, the CEO of a major Middle Eastern investment firm, made an observation that particularly resonated with me. Your story demonstrates that the skills required to defend against false allegations are exactly the same skills needed for executive leadership, strategic thinking, relationship building, and the ability to create coalitions around shared objectives. Her perspective highlighted connections I hadn't fully recognized between my experience with Vincent's harassment allegations and my subsequent success in business development and organizational leadership. The crisis had indeed forced me to develop capabilities that proved valuable in every subsequent challenge and opportunity. The months leading up to my transition to Chief Executive Officer were filled with intensive preparation and stakeholder meetings designed to ensure smooth leadership succession. Robert Harrison had been a mentor and advocate throughout my career at Meridian, and his guidance during the transition period was invaluable for understanding the broader responsibilities and relationships that came with the CEO role. Alexandra, you've already demonstrated that you can handle the strategic and operational aspects of this position, Robert told me during one of our transition planning sessions. The additional challenge of being CEO is managing the external relationships and public representation that come with the role. His advice proved prescient, as my appointment generated attention that extended well beyond the financial services industry. Business schools began incorporating case studies of my career trajectory into their curricula, while leadership development programs requested permission to use my experience as an example of effective crisis management and strategic response. The academic interest was flattering, but it also provided opportunities to influence how future business leaders would be trained to address workplace equity and organizational culture challenges. I accepted invitations to guest lecture at several prestigious business schools, using these platforms to encourage students to view social responsibility as integral to business strategy rather than as competing priorities. During a guest lecture at Northwestern Kellogg School of Management, a student asked a question that forced me to articulate something I hadn't previously expressed clearly. Miss Chen, do you think your experience with harassment allegations was ultimately beneficial for your career, even though it was traumatic at the time? The question was provocative and required careful consideration. I would never recommend that anyone experience false allegations or workplace harassment, I replied thoughtfully. However, I can say that learning to respond to those challenges with integrity and strategic thinking developed capabilities that have served me well in every subsequent leadership opportunity. The distinction was important because it avoided suggesting that adversity was inherently beneficial while acknowledging that how we respond to challenges can indeed create opportunities for growth and development. The key was developing resilience and strategic thinking skills that could transform difficult situations into sources of strength. As my official transition to Chief Executive Officer approached, I received an unexpected phone call that would provide closure to one of the most troubling aspects of my experience with Vincent's misconduct. Rebecca Martinez, the employment attorney who had represented Vincent's previous victims, called to inform me that he had been arrested on charges related to financial fraud at his subsequent employer. The investigation revealed that Vincent had been embezzling client funds and manipulating investment accounts, Rebecca explained. Apparently, his pattern of workplace misconduct was part of a broader tendency toward unethical behavior that eventually escalated to criminal activity. The news was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. Vincent's willingness to fabricate harassment allegations for personal advantage had demonstrated a fundamental lack of integrity that could easily extend to other areas of professional conduct. The escalation to criminal behavior suggested that his misconduct at Meridian had been part of a larger pattern of ethical failures. What's particularly significant, Rebecca continued, is that several women who had been targeted by his false allegations are now being interviewed as witnesses in the criminal investigation. Their experiences with his manipulative behavior are being recognized as evidence of a broader pattern of deception and misconduct. This development provided an additional form of vindication for all of Vincent's victims. Their experiences were finally being recognized not as isolated incidents, but as components of a systematic pattern of unethical behavior that had culminated in criminal activity. The validation was important for their healing and for establishing legal precedents about how workplace misconduct could escalate if left unchecked. The criminal investigation also reinforced the importance of the systemic changes that had been implemented at Meridian and other organizations. Companies that failed to address harassment and discrimination weren't just tolerating unethical behavior, they were potentially enabling individuals whose misconduct could escalate to criminal activity that would damage clients, employees, and stakeholders. My first year as Chief Executive Officer brought challenges and opportunities that tested every skill I had developed throughout my career. The integration of Nordic investment holdings required managing cultural differences, regulatory compliance issues, and operational complexities across multiple time zones and languages. However, the most significant challenge was establishing credibility with stakeholders who had never worked with a female CEO in the financial services industry. While my track record at Meridian was strong, some clients, partners, and competitors initially approached our relationship with skepticism about whether I could effectively lead a major international organization. The skepticism was particularly pronounced among some traditional institutional investors who had worked exclusively with male executives throughout their careers. During early meetings, I encountered subtle but unmistakable signs of doubt about my capabilities, ranging from questions about my decision-making authority to suggesting that they should speak directly with Robert Harrison about strategic matters. Rather than confronting these attitudes directly, I chose to demonstrate competence through consistent results and professional excellence. The same approach that had served me well in defending against Vincent's false allegations proved effective in establishing credibility as a CEO. Focus on facts, maintain high standards, and let performance speak for itself. The strategy proved successful as our financial results consistently exceeded projections and our client satisfaction scores reached record levels.
The Nordic acquisition was generating the projected synergies while expanding our market reach beyond initial expectations. Most importantly, our integrated approach to sustainable investing was attracting new clients who valued both financial returns and social responsibility. One particularly satisfying validation came during a presentation to the Pension Investment Association, a group representing some of the largest institutional investors in North America. The association's chairman, William Crawford, had initially been skeptical about our sustainability focus, viewing it as a potential distraction from maximizing returns. Ms. Chen, I have to admit that I was concerned about this environmental and social responsibility emphasis when you first became CEO, Crawford said during our annual review meeting.
But the results speak for themselves. Your funds are outperforming benchmarks while actually reducing risk through better governance and stakeholder management. His acknowledgement represented more than personal validation. It demonstrated that sustainable investment principles were gaining acceptance among the most conservative institutional investors. The combination of strong financial performance with positive social and environmental impact was proving to be a competitive advantage rather than a constraint on returns. The success of our sustainability initiatives led to recognition from industry organizations and regulatory bodies that were promoting responsible investment practices. The United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment invited me to join their advisory board, while the Financial Stability Board requested presentations about how environmental and social factors could be integrated into risk management frameworks. These external recognitions provided platforms for advocating broader adoption of responsible investment practices throughout the financial services industry. The positions also created opportunities to influence policy development and regulatory frameworks that would govern how sustainability factors were incorporated into investment decisions globally. During a presentation to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment Conference in New York, I addressed concerns that some institutional investors had expressed about whether responsible investing could generate sufficient returns to meet fiduciary obligations to beneficiaries. The question assumes that responsible investing requires sacrificing returns for social impact, I told the conference audience, but our experience demonstrates that companies with strong environmental, social, and governance practices often outperform their peers precisely because they manage risks more effectively and build more sustainable competitive advantages. The presentation was well received, and several major pension funds subsequently requested meetings to discuss how they could implement similar approaches in their own investment strategies. The combination of strong financial performance with positive social impact was proving attractive to institutional investors who faced pressure from beneficiaries to align investments with values. As my second year as CEO progressed, I was approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the workplace psychology consultant who had conducted the cultural review following Vincent's termination. She was writing a book about organizational transformation and requested permission to include Meridian's experience as a case study. Your story represents one of the most comprehensive examples I've seen of how individual advocacy can drive systemic organizational change, Dr. Walsh explained during our interview for her research. The progression from defending against false allegations to implementing company-wide culture improvements to becoming CEO demonstrates how personal integrity and strategic thinking can create transformative outcomes. Her perspective helped me understand how unusual my career trajectory had been. Most people who face harassment allegations, even when they are ultimately vindicated, experience lasting damage to their professional relationships and advancement opportunities. The fact that my experience had led to promotion and enhanced credibility was indeed exceptional. What factors do you think enabled your positive outcome when so many others in similar situations struggle with ongoing career damage? Dr. Walsh asked. I considered her question carefully before responding. I think the key was treating the false allegations as a business problem that required strategic solutions rather than as a personal attack that demanded emotional responses. By focusing on documentation, witness testimony, and systematic investigation, I was able to demonstrate that the allegations were fabricated while also identifying broader organizational issues that needed to be addressed. Dr. Walsh's research eventually became a Harvard Business School case study that was used in leadership development programs throughout the international business community. The case study examined how crisis management skills, stakeholder relationship building, and strategic thinking could be applied to workplace equity challenges. The academic recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it provided opportunities to influence how future business leaders would be trained to address similar challenges. Business schools began incorporating workplace equity and harassment prevention into their core curricula rather than treating these topics as peripheral concerns. My third year as CEO brought an unexpected opportunity that would test my leadership capabilities in new ways. The Federal Reserve Bank invited me to serve on a special committee examining how financial institutions could better support women and minority-owned businesses through improved access to capital and advisory services. The appointment represented recognition of my expertise in both financial services and equity issues, but it also carried significant responsibility for developing policy recommendations that could affect thousands of businesses and entrepreneurs. The committee's work would influence federal regulations and industry best practices for years to come. The committee's research revealed sobering statistics about persistent gaps in access to capital for women and minority entrepreneurs. Despite representing growing segments of new business formation, these groups continue to face systematic barriers in securing funding from traditional financial institutions. The data shows that bias in lending decisions isn't just harming individual entrepreneurs, I reported to the committee during one of our working sessions. It's also preventing financial institutions from accessing some of the fastest growing and most innovative business sectors in the economy. This perspective reframed the access to capital issue as a business opportunity rather than just a social responsibility concern. Financial institutions that developed better systems for evaluating and supporting diverse entrepreneurs could gain competitive advantages while advancing equity objectives. The committee's final recommendations included specific guidelines for bias reduction in lending decisions, enhanced mentorship and advisory programs for women and minority-owned businesses, and improved data collection requirements that would enable better monitoring of progress over time. The recommendations were adopted by federal banking regulators and became part of the framework used to evaluate financial institutions' community development activities. The policy changes represented tangible outcomes from my advocacy work that would benefit thousands of entrepreneurs and small business owners. As I reflected on my journey from harassment target to federal policy advisor, I was struck by how each challenge had prepared me for subsequent opportunities. The skills developed in defending against Vincent's false allegations had proven applicable to every leadership challenge I had faced since then. The experience had taught me that integrity, strategic thinking, and collaborative relationship building were not just moral imperatives, but also practical tools for achieving business objectives. The same capabilities that had enabled me to overcome false harassment allegations had also driven successful international business development, organizational transformation, and policy advocacy. Looking toward the future, I was excited about opportunities to continue expanding Meridian's global presence while advancing responsible investment practices and workplace equity initiatives. The combination of business success with positive social impact had proven attractive to institutional investors who faced pressure from beneficiaries to align investments with values. As my second year as CEO progressed, I was approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the workplace psychology consultant who had conducted the cultural review following Vincent's termination. She was writing a book about organizational transformation and requested permission to include Meridian's experience as a case study. Your story represents one of the most comprehensive examples I've seen of how individual advocacy can drive systemic organizational change, Dr. Walsh explained during our interview for her research. The progression from defending against false allegations to implementing company-wide culture improvements to becoming CEO demonstrates how personal integrity and strategic thinking can create transformative outcomes. Her perspective helped me understand how unusual my career trajectory had been. Most people who face harassment allegations, even when they are ultimately vindicated, experience lasting damage to their professional relationships and advancement opportunities. The fact that my experience had led to promotion and enhanced credibility was indeed exceptional. What factors do you think enabled your positive outcome when so many others in similar situations struggle with ongoing career damage? Dr. Walsh asked. I considered her question carefully before responding. I think the key was treating the false allegations as a business problem that required strategic solutions rather than as a personal attack that demanded emotional responses. By focusing on documentation, witness testimony, and systematic investigation, I was able to demonstrate that the allegations were fabricated while also identifying broader organizational issues that needed to be addressed. Dr. Walsh's research eventually became a Harvard Business School case study that was used in leadership development programs throughout the international business community. The case study examined how crisis management skills, stakeholder relationship building, and strategic thinking could be applied to workplace equity challenges. The academic recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it provided opportunities to influence how future business leaders would be trained to address similar challenges. Business schools began incorporating workplace equity and harassment prevention into their core curricula rather than treating these topics as peripheral concerns. My third year as CEO brought an unexpected opportunity that would test my leadership capabilities in new ways. The Federal Reserve Bank invited me to serve on a special committee examining how financial institutions could better support women and minority-owned businesses through improved access to capital and advisory services. The appointment represented recognition of my expertise in both financial services and equity issues, but it also carried significant responsibility for developing policy recommendations that could affect thousands of businesses and entrepreneurs. The committee's work would influence federal regulations and industry best practices for years to come. The committee's research revealed sobering statistics about persistent gaps in access to capital for women and minority entrepreneurs. Despite representing growing segments of new business formation, these groups continue to face systematic barriers in securing funding from traditional financial institutions. The data shows that bias in lending decisions isn't just harming individual entrepreneurs, I reported to the committee during one of our working sessions, it's also preventing financial institutions from accessing some of the fastest growing and most innovative business sectors in the economy. This perspective reframed the access to capital issue as a business opportunity rather than just a social responsibility concern. Financial institutions that developed better systems for evaluating and supporting diverse entrepreneurs could gain competitive advantages while advancing equity objectives. The committee's final recommendations included specific guidelines for bias reduction in lending decisions, enhanced mentorship and advisory programs for women and minority-owned businesses, and improved data collection requirements that would enable better monitoring of progress over time. The recommendations were adopted